Let's talk about scapegoats and scapegoating and both the destructive and healthy elements in, I guess, just understanding what's going on. So, reality is spherical. That's the most graceful, multidimensional. It's an infinitely dimensional shape, and it is the most efficient shape to navigate with. It's perfectly balanced, and it takes very little energy to move it in any different direction. However, it's that very infinite nature of the sphere that makes it problematic for human consciousness, because one of the things that's been said is that a sphere is an infinite number of points and lines. And there is at the certain moment of reality that point where reality has to determine whether it's a wave or a particle, that point in subatomic particle physics, where depending on how you observe it, it's either a particle or a wave, but not at the same moment. And in that aspect, we, the conscious mind of our culture, is a line or a point-based consciousness, meaning almost all of our consciousness as we know it is filtered and emerges in the distinctions brought about by language. So we have the field of consciousness, and then we have language, which is constructed of points, letters, and words, which are constructed of a bunch of other letters and words, which create an area of meaning. So while we cannot, within the human mind, grasp an infinite number of points, what we do is we divide the sphere down into a series of distinctions that we are capable of grasping. Now, 7 is a number that's often, discovered by sociologists and teachers and different people trying to simplify things to a point where they can be worked with. We can easily remember, 3 things. 7 is a little bit of a stretch if we're trying to answer a complex question like how to create a great and balanced life. If you just go on infinitely, you get lost. And so we refract the sphere. We use a division number of distinctions to refract the sphere down to a certain number of distinctions that we can track. And so, Stephen Covey in his book, 7 Habits for Highly Effective People, refracted time down into, there were 4 quadrants, urgent and not important, urgent and important, not urgent and not important, and not urgent and very important. And one of the things that a refraction does is it gives you a focus. Spheres are infinitely balanced, but in the momentum of consciousness and growth and life within a dualistic paradigm, you move by leaning hard in this direction, and then just as you're about to fall over, because if you just keep leaning infinitely in any one direction, you fall over as a bipedal organism, then you lean into the other direction, and you are just about to fall over, and this is called walking. This is called forward momentum, and you move towards something, idealizing it just to the point that it's going to kill you, and then you move towards something else, on the opposite side, which is why we see the swing where, we start off in this culture, happily enjoying ourselves until that's, beaten out of us, and then we pursue money with a desperate fervor, and those blessed or cursed enough to get a lot of money usually discover how toxic it is and lean hard to the other side and start meditating and stuff. But it's this forward motion of leaning and leaning and leaning that leads to life. It's this awareness that balance, a bipedal unit is not terribly symmetrical and balanced, but if you are going to have two legs, finding the center point is the point of grace. This is just geometry. If you want to lean a heavy weight at a 45-degree angle, it's very hard to hold and it pulls you out of whack. You hold it vertically, a single human being can rest a pole on the ground that's quite heavy with very little energy. And so this is consciousness interacting with reality through a lens, in this case a lens of 5 senses, the primary physical senses. We're trying to relate, consciousness, senses, this body, the entire rest of the universe, this tiny little fragment of stuff that we know, which is always getting a little bigger as a species. Our knowledge is expanding exponentially. And yet, as it expands exponentially, there is always the larger reality, because the more it expands, the more we realize how big the multiverse is. And so really, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, until you can just enjoy the humor, the reality that 99.99999% of all that has ever been and will be, the entire field of probability, possibility, and this multiverse in just our 3 dimensions is so big that 99.999% is unknown. And of what's unknown, 99.9% of that is unknown. We don't even know that we don't know it, because you just take the 5 senses and you start adding senses. You start imagining, because the body could be construed as an measuring, a measuring instrument, observing and measuring. So senses observe and they measure. That sound was higher than that sound. There was a sound. So the body is an observing and measuring device with 5 instruments. Now we can use those 5 instruments to create infinite numbers of other instruments. Binoculars that see in the dark, they're a new instrument, so we observe new data. As soon as we look through those binoculars, we see things moving around at night that we didn't see with these instruments. And we understand that the world is a little bigger in that way. As soon as we add microscope technology, we add another measuring device, and we learn about the microscopic world. When you have a microscope, you learn about that world. And if you can understand that reality is really, 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 really big, and it gets bigger based on how many things you observe it through. You look through a UV filter, and suddenly you can see UV radiation and stuff that you didn't see before. What this points to is the fact that there are infinite observing and measuring devices and infinite realities to observe within those observing and measuring devices. And there's no sign within the next 1,000 human lifetimes, the next 10,000 years, there's no sign that we would ever hit a barrier. In fact, far more likely is virtual reality is coming into focus. Far more likely, we are going to start exploring reality within the microchip. We'll create new realities that didn't even exist long before we explore the full spectrum of reality that we're just getting a tiny grip on. And it's also insightful if we understand that the past repeats itself until we learn the lesson. It's insightful to realize that when Louis Pasteur first postulated germ theory, because he noticed that the doctors who didn't wash their hands were killing a lot of surgery patients. So he started washing his hands before he knew why he was washing his hands. This is a very unscientific approach, by the way. It just happens to save a lot of lives. So he starts washing his hands and he noticed that if he sterilizes the blade, heats instruments, washes things thoroughly, that more patients live. And the dogma of the day was, that if you were strong, you would live. So the doctors scoffed and mocked Louis with his hand-washing rituals and kept murdering their patients because they knew with certainty that germs didn't exist because you couldn't see them. And we all know that reality is as small as our limited ability to perceive it, right? I'm the center of the universe. The Catholic Church has been teaching that for a while. We throw that out, okay? We're not the center of the universe. In fact, we're a very, 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 very tiny part of a very, very, very big universe, and we're not even the center of that. So we throw that out, and then I'm the center of the universe in the new way, the egoic consciousness that says, if I don't see it, it doesn't exist. So I can now see through a telescope, I see that, but I don't see it yet through a microscope. And so if we understand that we've been dealing with layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of hubris in human history, we can assume, since we're still dealing with big egos all over the place, we can assume that most of what we're so attached to right now is going to be humbled by a greater complexity that is yet to come. And this is not going to be a greater complexity of that throws out, as in, the second coming of Jesus and then all science is rot or anything. No. The discovery of germ theory did not supplant what we see with our eyes. It complements it. It's more and more complex. It's not this or this. It's more than that. So it's not that Christianity is going to wipe out Hinduism, or religion is going to wipe out science, or science is going to wipe out religion. But really, it's looking through different lenses. The heart is a scientific instrument, and it reveals things about reality that the mind or the eyes can't see directly. It reveals. We see things through the lens of the heart that we don't see through the lens of the eyes, and we see things through the lens of the eyes that we don't see through the lens of the heart. However, they are all observing and measuring devices that tell us a piece of reality. And of course, when we get dogmatic, when we ignore one part of the perspective, that's when we start moving towards imbalance and blindness. And when we move too far into imbalance and blindness, it takes more and more energy to sustain life. And if we move too far, we start killing ourselves. And that's usually the wake-up call that pivots a fear-based, because when we have a lot of trauma in our body, trauma is a transcendent experience. It threatens death to the ego. And the ego reacts to that threatening of death to the ego with a fervorish, manic, fight, flight, freeze, compulsion, etc., anything at all possible to keep the ego alive. And so in this framework of keeping the ego alive, one of the things that it does is attacks the unknown, which is attacking itself. because it's from the unknown that all of these transcendent forces come. It's out there. It's, these huge giant parents. It's the shock that comes from the entire world. So, we double up and shake our fists at that 99.999% of reality that is unknown, which is also ourselves. This is a very, paradoxical dance, because we pretend in this little frame of references that I'm separate from you and I'm separate from everything around me. But the science of it says something quite different. The science says that I don't exist without my mother and father. My mother and father doesn't exist without a whole series of other relationships. I don't exist without the air. I shut off my air. I don't exist in a matter of 3 or 4 minutes. I shut off food. I stop existing in a matter of months. I shut off, drink. I stop existing in a matter of days. I shut off heat. I freeze to death. The science shows that we are deeply and intricately woven and connected all over the place. The science says that we turn our back on a poor and traumatized family in China. We influence that culture by saying that money is more important than people. They take on the message that their dignity in life is not very important. They stay alive, eating, unsafe meats and engaging with their animals and not washing and this and that and the other. Swine flu fever crosses the species barrier at its weakest point. You see, it's all very well to have a boat, and a species is like a boat, but at the weakest point in the boat is where the water will come in, right? And once it comes in, it comes into the whole boat. A species is a boat. Now, we don't understand that because we're operating within Western Consciousness 1.0. Western Consciousness 1.0 says, I don't care about you unless you can make me money. That's capitalism. You are important to the degree that you can turn $1 into $2. Now, this is a paradigm. It's not the worst paradigm. It's not the best paradigm. But it is a paradigm that has limitations. And it's this bit that comes back to the scapegoat. It's the paradigm that has limitations, and the limitation of the paradigm of why on earth would I, this separate entity, care about this 7-year-old girl who's being sold to, for obscene tourists or whatever to have sex with an animal, way off in some Chinese village, because some tourists thought it would be fun to give them a few $100s and they're starving. Why would we care about that? It's good old capitalism, right? It's not our daughter who's doing that. It's, whatever. We're here. That's what's important. Let's get on with our Christian lives and all this. So we have this illusion that somehow we're separate, when the science says we're deeply interconnected. Now, the point is, whether it's swine virus or any other virus that is going to threaten, millions, if not billions of lives over the next 1,000 years, in every case, it will enter the species at its most vulnerable point, which are the people that we, within the hierarchy of social programming, have determined are not worth protecting. It would be very much like our physical body saying that, oh, this head, it's so wonderful, isn't it? I mean, all those ideas and all those fascinating words. Oh, just give me that head. Please, I adore this head. But meanwhile, get away, toes, get away. So you don't wash your toes. You don't clean your toes. You don't, you don't keep your toes safe. You step on rusty nails because that's the toes. You've dissociated from a part of your own body. And so bacteria and infection comes in. It works its way up the leg. And then finally, oh, what a tragedy. This beautiful head is finally killed because it's connected to the body. And so cultures do this on a very large scale because viruses are not racist. Viruses are not political. Viruses are interested in growing and propagating themselves just like anything else. And the sophistication of a species is how it treats its most vulnerable, marginalized, disenfranchised, politically incorrect minority. The gauge of a species is how well it does that. How much love, care, devotion, intelligence, kindness, health, humanity. Humanity and love is about helping another human being survive, feel secure in that survival, feel a sense of love and belonging, and then from there a sense of self-esteem. And if you do that, the species evolves. Now, this can be done in little cliques, like you're not in my family, so we don't care about you. We rape, we steal, we do this, that to the neighbors, but not to our own little family. Or not to me. I do it to you, but not to me. That's the most basic. Then we do it to a little bit more complex, a little bit more sophisticated. We do it to this family, but not to our family. A little bit more complex. Our community, our town. Who cares about those, idiots over in that other town? Our country, our state, it's always ours against this. And to a certain extent, you need both. You need the boundary, but you need to know mentally that it's a focusing tool. It's more like, okay, first let's get our own lives together. Next, let's, help the family grow. Next, let's move out into the community. And so there's a focusing process of this. So to a certain extent that makes sense. But we need to understand that this is for focusing. It's not for morality. It's not because the person in the next town who has a different political belief or whatever is less valuable than you. It's not because they're more valuable either, but and they're not more or worse valuable, than your family, etc. They are on certain metrics, and it's important to to understand that. But every single human being, from a viral point of view, survival, security, love, and belonging is what locks survival and security in place. It's a hierarchy of values. If you are loved and you belong with people that know how to love themselves and feel secure in that, you will survive. You see, and so it's a hierarchy of needs as a species. And so when we understand that the biggest threat to us as a species comes in the format of the allowing of the most malnourished, tortured, abused people anywhere on the planet, then we understand that this is the weakest link in the species from a viral point of view, from an economic point of view, from a social point of view. It's the weakest point in the species. Without this, the boat will sink. At the point where water breaches the most vulnerable area in the structure of the species. Our biology is a boat. Our consciousness is a boat. The membranes of our body, a boat. And there are energy structures all over the place, constantly evolving and growing, that can invade and destroy that boat. And so to the extent that we care about our species, it begins by looking at those thin areas in the boat where just a few taps and water is going to gush in. Now, this is less of an issue when you don't have global travel. So in that area, you could really have, a whole continent just decimated by Black Plague or whatever, and, the Native American Indians didn't get the Black Plague, But as we realize more of our potential, we start transmitting patterns of energy, this town in China to this area here to this area here, as we realize these patterns of energy and start moving them. Then as soon as this part starts to collapse financially, everything else does. As soon as this part starts to collapse socially, everything else does. As soon as violence erupts over here and the meme that produced the violence spreads in the consciousness, it gets produced over here. Gary Slutkin has, as an epidemiologist, has done some great work to illustrate how the virus of violence behaves more like an epidemic than anything else. It's, you can tell where the next episode of violence will be, just like you can predict where the next flu epidemic outbreak will be, based on where the last piece was. So we have a little bit of, we can produce epidemics of violence that spread. Now, as we come back to this sense of, the sphere that's being refracted in all these different ways, so that we can get our head around it, so that we can comprehend it. We can dumb the complexity of the multiverse down to a level of paradigm and thought that we have some sense of what we're doing in that domain. When we do that, then we create a remainder, is what we do. We create a remainder, because if you take a circle or a sphere and you say infinite shapes and all that, I'm going to divide it down into 5. I can grasp that. There's my work, there's my love life, or if we're very unsophisticated, our sex life. There's, our friendships, there's our religion, and there's me time. Okay, so we're going to divide the infinite diversity of time down into these 5 categories. And then we say, well, what do we have to do to improve work? But realize we're making good progress. I mean, when we're just dealing with the infinite complexity of things, it's hard to move. When you're in the center of the circle, it's just there. But when you want to, move forward in some way, you refract reality down into some paradigm of movement. We need more food. Food is good. Pleasure is good. Food makes more pleasure. This kind of food makes more pleasure than that kind of food, so let's do this kind of food. When we do this, it's, we start making things happen. Though it's interesting to note the correlation between human beings on the planet and cancer in our body, because cancer is a phenomena of cells that start growing chaotically out of sync with the host body. And if they keep doing that, consuming the host in order to grow rapidly, then the cancer ultimately destroys itself when the host dies. Because cancer is on a suicide mission on one level. Now, this is just a thought. And all of these are just for trying on, meaning I'm not sure if that's the best way of looking at that by any means. In fact, I feel quite sad when I do, which through that lens tells me I could be off base there. But one of the things to be aware of is that as a human species, we have gotten these ideas. We've refracted realities down into paradigms such as capitalism and this, and money is good, and this and that and the other. And we are very, very rapidly stripping, mining, turning, polluting, concentrating, all kinds of things within the earth to pursue these little bits here. And we are killing ourselves in a variety of different ways. We are killing species. We are damaging our own lungs, our planet, etc. In that sense, there is a correlation between frenetic, chaotic, rapid activity that is out of sync with the host body. Now, we're trained in Western consciousness to see ourselves as different from the earth, so what I do to you isn't what I do to me. The science does not support this. You know, on a superficial level, we can say, I have a bag of garbage in the house, stuff that I don't know what to do with after I've used certain things. So I stick it all up in this garbage bag, something that we've made out of language and bits of petroleum, and I don't want to look at it, and so I take it outside of my house and I say, go away, put it over here. And some countries, they just throw it in the street. Some countries take it out and burn all that plastic, and then they breathe it. This is going on in Thailand right now, burning garbage and breathing it. And some very poor countries, they actually need the warmth from burning plastic to stay alive in cold winters because we don't care about that. Now, this is fucking up brain chemistry. You know, this is destroying things. The children raised with fucked up brain chemistry have consequences. You know, and they will migrate around the world affecting, you know. So there's this interconnectedness in the reality that is very pleasantly partitioned within this myopic view of the five senses. And one of the biggest things, if we look back to Stephen Covey and that category of not urgent, but very important, the people in the boat of the species that is most vulnerable to capsizing are the not urgent to me, because it might take a generation. It might take 10 years. It might take a month before the capsize, you know, over in some rural village in China to hit me here, to hit my daughter. It might be my grandson that gets hit with the wave of capsize that I created when I said, using a paradigm of distinction that says I'm separate from you, when I said, well, who cares about their children? They're not mine. Okay, nice thought. Now I don't have to do anything. It's efficient, meaning it's saved me energy. I can go back to watching TV. It's not mine. This creates an enormous amount of grief because pain levels go up, but we don't understand why, because we're operating within this paradigm that, you know, what I do to you over there or what I don't do is not my fault. It's not my responsibility. And every operating system, as we say, there's a, you know, it's about working with it in a paradigm that is better than nothing. If you understand that everything you know is wrong, but it's in some cases better than nothing, in some cases worse than nothing, and in some cases it's a lot better than nothing. It's a lot better than nothing, but it's still wrong. It's true enough, but it's not true. Well, in this case, we come back to scapegoating. And scapegoating is named that way because in some of our older cultures, in which at a very crude level, people were good or bad. There was good and evil. And this becomes, it becomes kind of objective when you experience something that is incredibly toxic to a very beautiful form of life. It's incredibly toxic. And, just you can feel the intensity of it, and it's like, arsenic in the body. It's not that arsenic is good or bad. It is just incredibly toxic and malevolent to something very beautiful if you pour it into a newborn baby. And within our partitioned consciousness, we see all of the good that is dying. We don't necessarily see the fact that, that baby would have been a rape survivor thanks to our culture, would have had a 1 in 7 chance in America of starting a substance addiction to manage trauma. And so we don't see all of that, but we certainly see the goodness, evaporating from the life as we pour in that arsenic. And we don't see that arsenic, has a chemical function within the biology and the totality of, our ecology. But we do see that it's, very toxic in a concentrated dose inside a human baby. As we refract reality into these shapes of what reality is, etc. First of all, there's a remainder. If you take 7 and divide it by 2, you get 3 with a remainder of 1. Now, in simple geometry, in simple paradigms, what we do is we tell that 1 to go away because it's messing with the system, right? Being able to say, 7 divided by 2 is 3. We've simplified things. That's a relief. And now it is. You can fit. You see it, and it's helpful. It's a working model. But there's this bit that's left over. And this is the bit that is the uninvited guest, the bit that we ask to go away. This is the bit in culture where we say being positive is good and being cheerful is good. And so go away sadness, go away negativity, go away constructive criticism. We don't want you. We want this good, positive stuff over here. And you're the counterpoint. You're not good and positive. You're this. Go away. When we create these paradigms, that of what's good, there is a remainder, not due to the sophistication of reality, but due to the simplicity of the human brain and the paradigms we use to measure what's good. We say, this is good. We see it. We want more of that. And so we banish its counterpoint. Now, at some point, this is toxic. It can be one thing, okay, we're having a party, let's not talk about politics. Reasonable banishing. We're having a birthday party, let's not do business. Reasonable, banishing, etc. But when we start saying there is no healthy place in our whole culture to grieve, to express the rage, to explore the outrage of what is going on, of the enormous burden of suffering and hostility and hatred poured into this group. When we start to say there's no place for any of that, now we're spending more and more energy dividing reality up into different parts and using one part to fight the other. Well, this consumes more and more energy. You have more and more depression and exhaustion because, a negative thought comes in and you say, I don't think negatively, go away. Well, that's all negative right there. I don't, that's negative, a negative term. Go away, that's negative. Why not embrace things? And then you think, I'm bad for not embracing this. So now I'm bad about that. And now I'm bad about thinking that I was bad about that. And so you start dividing and pushing and just slamming one part of the psyche into another. You're slamming one part of reality into another. When the Western cultures wanted to dominate other parts of the world, that's what they did. They would go to a continent and then they would bribe one tribe to attack the other tribe in the delusion that they were separate. When the entire tribal system lost and a foreign power came in that had no respect for the culture or traditions within those tribes, but it's divide to conquer, divide and destroy. You have to divide. And so our paradigms of what is good and what is bad divide us and destroy us by refusing to allow a home, by refusing to invite the guest that's not welcome, the part that's most hurt, the part that's most in shame, the part that is most terrorized and lonely, the part that is most politically incorrect, that doesn't know what they're doing, that's most in a chauvinistic culture, most in the body. It's the tittering minds. Reminds me of an old Star Trek episode where these Greeks got superhuman kinetic power mentally and would just torment people through their mind and their endless superiority, making slaves, etc., until someone else got the power, and then, then they were, brought out of their stupor of addictive control. There is a part in this process that is made into a scapegoat. The scapegoat is the part that is the remainder, the bit left over that we don't know what to do with because we lack the sophistication in a paradigm to know what to do with. But our heart knows on some level that part needs a home as well. Now, what some of our ancestors did at this time is there'd be two goats. And one of them, somewhat randomly, would be made into the scapegoat. And so everything that was hateful within the paradigm, everything that was fearful within the paradigm, was put onto this innocent goat, smeared with blood, and it was banished out of the town with rocks. And this is a ritual that acknowledges what's going on, that this is what we're doing to this part of the psyche. We're cutting ourselves into bits, and we're banishing it out into the wilderness to die and wither and become sick and lonely and all of that. And that this is a reflection. This is a reflection of, in one could say, the fall out of the garden. The knowledge of good and evil is the knowledge of division. And so when you're in the garden, you're in the sphere. There is no good and there is no evil. There's just an integrated ecology of growing reality. There's a lot of grace there. And then we start coming in and we start saying this is good and this is good and this is good and that's bad and that's bad and that's bad. And we fall out of the garden. We start fighting with ourselves. We start fighting with each other. We need a symbolic representation to acknowledge this ritual of what we cast out. Lucifer is cast out of the angels for his devotion to God, his devotion, his jealousy of wanting to be the one chosen and all of that, cast out for that part. And in many ways within the culture, we cast out jealousy, for example. Jealousy is one of the phenomena that is experienced when you need someone, when you love someone, when you admire someone, you want to be close to them and you need them. And you have a feeling that you won't get that in some other place. And then someone else comes in and takes some of that, and within a dualistic paradigm, there's limited resources. If some woman is sleeping with my man, I'm not sleeping with my man on that same time. Something was taken from me in order for that to happen. And I'm jealous, and I'm angry, and I feel hatred and helpless. And a lot of what we do within civilized culture is we cast that out. Well, go away. When you're willing to stop being jealous and small, then you can come back. Go away. We don't want that. And so it's a very complex thing for a Western mind to get around, to understand. But if we understand that the scapegoat is produced by the remainder of the paradigm in the cult, that it is the energy that doesn't fit into the system, that there is no system that the human brain can conceive on a cultural level that fully embraces all the energy. But that obviously, if you divide the sphere by 2, and you said half of it is bad and half of it is good, it's a pretty, there's a pretty crude remainder. In order to exist and be good, you've got to reject and banish 50% of who you are. Now, if you can, divide the sphere into 10, and then you just take the sphere and 10, and you divide it into 10, there will be slivers on the outside of the sphere this way, but also depending on how dimensional the slice is, is it an infinitely shape where you do 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, and it all fits together into a 10-sided shape? Does the sphere divide into 10, as a 3-dimensional shape? There's going to be slices of reality left off. And those slices are what facilitate grace. And so much of the challenge of the human consciousness is to move towards the symmetry of the sphere while existing in highly out of sync, highly unbalanced fragments of reality created by dualistic thinking. So, this dualistic thinking of good and evil as absolutes, coming in and chopping things up and moving, has created incredibly concentrations of toxic energy, radiation, nuclear radiation. It's a concentrated energy, and it's, there's, arsenic and, bubonic plague and napalm, these concentrated forces of toxicity that, you touch this and it's bad because, you just get anywhere near it and you're dead. And so, how do you navigate back towards the symmetry within all these concentrated parts of toxicity? Well, the image that I have is, around the cultural phenomena of the scapegoat is, one of musical chairs. So, for example, if you have 100 people and you have 99 chairs, that circle creates one scapegoat, the person who isn't welcome at the table. And so it's really about the sophistication to create roles. We say a chairperson, chairman of the board of directors, or the head of a school, or a teacher in a school. These are roles within a culture. Now, when a culture has a good 1,000 roles, there are very few scapegoats. When you have a role for emotional integration of infants, when you have a role for emotional literacy, when you have a field out in the public space, and this is the grief field where you go to grieve and be around people wailing and grieving, and this is the grief field, and this is the anger field, and this is the place for drunken orgy, and this is the place for this is the place for protecting infants and from animals, and this is the place where people with exotic pets come to engage, and this is the place where you fly your radio control planes, and this is the place where you race really fast, and this is the place where you go very slow. This is the silent place. When you create spaces within a cultural framework that honors the entire psyche, when you create roles that facilitate the entire area of emotion of the psyche, all voices, and there is a space where they are honored within your life, within the community, within the thought paradigm, and within time, the celebrations and rituals. In India, they have a temple of the rats. It's moving in that direction. Nobody gets bitten. Nobody gets sick. Tens of thousands of rats fed in a temple all the time. This is the kind of thing where, it's like, that doesn't fit. What doesn't fit is the part of yourself that you cut off in order to fit in to the narrow cult, in order to belong so that you can feel secure in your survival. In a cult that is traumatized, that rejects everything, that doesn't fit in, if you don't belong to that, you are rejected. Your survival level goes down, your trauma level goes up, and your urgent visceral need is to lie, if necessary, and cut off bits of yourself to say, please accept me, I've cut myself down to almost nothing, I'm not a threat anymore, I don't contain any of that unknown. Oh, all right. But you understand that, poor young women are nothing. They're dirt in this cult. You sure you want to join it? Okay, well then be dirt, Get on with it. And no more complaining. No more new ideas. Don't threaten the status quo any. Get back to your chores and apologize for getting out of line. And so this is a very poignant moment. It's a very poignant moment in this cult dynamic. And when you add another chair so that there's room for all 100 people, now you have an ecology without a scapegoat. The U.S. is in trouble because it's imprisoning more of its population than any other developed country, which means it's not developed. It's behaving like a cult. It's banishing the so we have numerous areas: political correctness, imprisoning, exaggerating of all these kind of things, paradoxical divides, you're right, you're wrong. This is a deteriorating and a collapsing culture because it's creating more and more energy that has to be held by the scapegoat. A culture that is growing is learning to embrace more and more of what it is. As truth, as beauty, as goodness, it's moving back towards the sphere. And the step that anyone can take is to own the part in them that is allowing and enabling the scapegoat to be produced and banished. Energy doesn't come out of nowhere. The way a population behaves determines the level of trauma and abuses within that culture, which determines the level of violence and all of that. If we understand our passive role and our active role in that, we bring these parts back into the circle and own it as our issue, our path, our journey to take a stand for that which is most vulnerable, most marginalized, most banished, most misunderstood, and that is carrying the burden of blame of the entire culture's inadequacy to embrace itself.